Welcome to this week's episode of Everyday Thin Places. I'm Rachel Gallagher, and I'm an interfaith hospice chaplain.
And I'm Elizabeth Ferrasso, and I'm a birth doula.
And in each episode of Everyday Thin Places, we draw from our experiences supporting birthing people and dying people to explore with honesty, authenticity, and humor how we can all become more truly living people.
Today, you'll be hearing our conversation with Andrea Hope, who is a mother, a poet, and a member of the Baha'i faith. We were really honored that she took the time to speak with us and to share about her life and to share her poetry. And not just share her poetry with us, but to give us thoughtful and practical tips about how we can all use poetry in our quest to experience everyday thin places. She recently released her book of poetry called To Mother, and has a podcast by the same name, where she explores the intersection of parenting and her Baha'i faith. But if you think that her experience and wisdom are only relevant for people who share her particular belief system or who are parents, you would be missing out on the powerful and profound and practical wisdom that Andrea has to offer.
So we became acquainted with Andrea through some mutual podcasting friends, and she was actually one of the people who was kind enough to respond to our query about, have you ever heard of thin places? And if you have, or if you haven't, what do you think that term means? And then she was extra kind to follow that up with a willingness to record this episode with us to speak about poetry as a thin place. We knew that her time was extra precious because she needed to schedule the time around caring for her two young children. But this was really funny. We didn't even realize. It was like the day before our recording that we realized she was going to be calling from 6 time zones away in Poland. You'll hear sweet little voices here and there during this episode, and if you could see what we could see on our screens as we talked with her, it was just getting progressively darker and darker as she carried on this conversation well past her kids' typical bedtime.
And this interview runs a little longer than most of our others, but we just didn't have the heart to cut out anything more than we already did to tidy it up. We think that when all is said and done, you'll appreciate that we didn't deny you anything that you're going to hear in this episode, and that you'll be ready to explore more of what Andrea has to offer. Don't worry, we will have lots of links on the show notes for this episode, which you can find on our website, everydaythinplaces.com, so that you can read more and hear more from Andrea. But now, without further delay, here is our conversation with mother, poet, and Baha'i, Andrea Hope. All right, Andrea, it is really such an honor to get to speak with you today. Rachel and I didn't actually know until we were sort of putting the pieces together in the past couple of days that not only were you finding time as the mother of 2 small children to take time to talk to us, but that you were going to be checking in from a total other time zone. So we especially appreciate that you are taking this time to be with us. And in addition, your precious evening time that is extra special that you're spending that time with us. So, yeah, let's dig right into what we were going to talk about today. I sort of, in just reading about you, listening to your podcast, and learning what I could about you, it seems like there's 3 primary identities that I hear you describe about yourself when you're introducing yourself to other people, and that's yourself as a poet, yourself as a mother, and yourself as a Baha'i. Can you tell me a little bit more? Tell us about sort of the order in which some of these parts of you developed, and maybe how those different aspects of who you are have impacted each other. Maybe how they're sort of informing the way that you see the world and the words that you describe through your poetry.
Yeah, thank you for having me and my baby, who you'll probably hear throughout this conversation, little goo goo gagas. That's an interesting question. All 3 of those identities are things that I feel come naturally to me. Those are three things that really in my life I have found bring me the most purpose, like are the most meaningful for me, and that I have tried to develop over time. So with what should I start with? I guess the most important being a Baha'i. So the Baha'i faith is my faith. And my great grandmother, when I was growing up, who I grew up with, was a Baha'i. And my mom went to church. She went to Baptist church. And we were really allowed to go to both. And I did go to both. And then at a certain point, we could make a decision about what we wanted to do with our faith. My family's always been quite open about that. So I made the decision to continue with Baha'i activities. And it was something where I have challenged it a couple of times, but it's something that it just, felt like for me that this was the right thing and it felt natural. And yeah, the few times that I did question it, I thought about going to Christianity because in university, for example, my closest friends were Christians. And so I used to go to Campus Crusade for Christ with all these Christians, and they would assume that I was Christian because there was maybe 7 Baha'is at my university, and we also did activities. But the Christian community was much bigger and so close to the kinds of virtues and morals. So I went with Campus Crusade for Christ, and I did service in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and I did all these things with that. And so they assumed that I was Christian. And then when they found out that I was not, that was very difficult sometimes because it's like we have everything in common except this one thing, which is the most important to most people. So I kind of had a crisis at that time. Okay, maybe I should be Christian. And I went and I lived in Lesotho for 6 months, which is in southern Africa. And I really tried to use that time to read the Bible and really try to reflect on who I am. And the passage that the Bible is a long read, and the Old Testament is a lot of this person begot that person. But the thing that was most significant to me was a passage that talked about you will know a tree by its fruits, and it said something like a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. And so I really looked at my faith and my connection to the Baha'i faith in whether it was producing good fruit in my life and whether I felt like that was aligned with God's will. And so from there, I was able to make the decision to be reaffirmed in my faith. And I just feel like everything that I've done centered on, oh, you okay, buddy? I just feel like everything I've done centered in this faith, I've gotten great confirmations from, and that's been really important to me. So I know at one point, I guess if you're of any religion, you might have experienced this where people say, well, what if there's nothing? What if you die and then there's nothing? And I would say, for me, if I died and there's nothing, I still lived a better life believing in God and believing in virtues than I would have if I didn't. And that's 100% for sure. So I really believe that there's something. I actually, to the point where I probably scare people with how comfortable I am with death, because I really don't believe that this is it. Like, I really just believe that this is our consciousness in a physical realm and that it will continue. But even if for some reason it didn't, then I still feel that my life was really benefited by believing in spiritual principles and having a personal relationship with God. So, should I move to the next one?
Yeah.
Poetry.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Poetry was something that, all these things, okay, no, these first two things both have a bit to do with my time in Lesotho, actually. So poetry was something that I naturally gravitated towards in school. I'm not exactly sure why, and didn't like to analyze poetry, but I loved poetry because I kind of was like, I don't know what this person was trying to say. Some of the poets that we had to analyze, it was really abstract, but I still loved poetry. And as I said, I grew up very close to my great grandparents, and my grandfather passed away when I was in middle school, and he was really the glue that held our family together. So because of him, during holidays, everyone would come to our house because we lived in a duplex with my great grandparents. So everyone would come to us for holidays, and he was just such an example, kind of soft spoken, very humble guy. And so that was a big thing for me. It was my first, big experience with death. And after that, I wrote a lot of poems. And I wrote a poem called Suffering. I'm thinking I'm like 11 years old. And I wrote a poem called Suffering. And
Wow.
I wrote a poem called Blind Men, which was this poem about how I wish everyone was blind so that we couldn't judge each other based on what we look like and we could feel each other's
Mm.
energy. And so I was like, wow, I was really going through it when I was 11. But yeah, that
Yeah.
was the first time I wrote all these poems in this little book, and I remember giving it to my great grandmother, and she kept it, forever. I'm sure I can go back and find it in some box from back home. But yeah, I didn't realize at the time that it was therapeutic for me, but it really was. It really helped me channel my energy, and I always kind of did that page poetry, and if I had an opportunity to share it, then I would. And then in university, my high school didn't have a performance poetry team, and my university didn't either. I didn't know about these concepts. So, for people who don't know, there are performance poetry groups in high school. You can do a competition, and in college. But I didn't know about these things, and my schools didn't have them. So, when I was in college, I think I went to a Valentine's Day show, and someone got up in between the musicians and did a poem, and people applauded, and it was nice. And I was like, oh, people listen to each other read poetry. I was like, oh, this is a thing. You can perform poetry on a stage. It just blew my mind. So the next event that organization had, I did a poem, and that kind of put in my mind that, oh, there's performance poetry. So when I went to Lesotho and I was just thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, I realized that I was interested in a lot of things, but I didn't feel like I was striving for excellence in any of them. I felt like I was kind of doing the jack of all trades things, but I hadn't chosen something that I could
Mm.
strive for excellence in. And so I made a decision that when I got back to the United States, I would do that. And I chose poetry. And so when I was in Lesotho with this very bad internet connection, I would use my time to look up, poetry events. And I found the National Poetry Slam. And it was having an event that summer, I think a couple weeks after I was getting back in St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I thought, okay, that's it. I'm going to go to this event and meet some poets and start, I guess, honing my craft and connecting with people. And so I did. I went there. I ended up staying in a hotel with complete strangers on the floor. And it was so funny because I went there, and when I was on the bus or going to different events, people would ask me, "Oh, what team are you on?" And I'd be like, "Team?" Like, "Oh, I'm not on a team. I just came like because there's poetry. I heard there's poetry and I came." And then people would be like, "Oh, well, who did you come with, or how were you organized?" And I was like, "Oh, I just found it and I showed up." So I think that was very strange for people because most people were on a team with, some group, or at least were hosting it or organizing it. But yeah, that was really, really wonderful. And a few years later, I moved to Portland, Oregon, because they had just a really great poetry scene and also just nice natural environment. And there were so many opportunities there to be an artist and to go to workshops and to go to open mics. So that's really where I
Mhm.
did a lot of work as a performing poet. And I do still think there's a difference between being a page poet and a performing poet. And so now I've gotten a bit more, since having
Yeah.
children, back into page poetry. But yeah, I did have the two dynamics of doing page poetry and doing performance poetry.
Well, and I think, maybe it looks a little bit different, but you're still a performance poet because you share a lot of your poetry on your podcast. So while you're not standing on a stage in front of a live audience, your poetry is being performed and shared with an even wider audience across the world, which I think is so,
Yeah,
so
that's
cool.
true. I guess in terms of how I write it, I guess there's a
Uh-huh.
difference. Like I didn't include any of my spoken word poetry in my poetry books that I published because, let's say, why did I? Because I feel like performance poetry is a little bit more like stand up comedy,
Mhm.
where it's if you get the joke, you get it, and if you don't, there's no time to explain it, you know? So I
Mhm.
feel when I write performance poetry, I really am trying to be more direct. It has a bit more direct humor and it's more conversational. Like I want to talk to the person like we're having a conversation or they're a close friend. Whereas with page poetry, the main difference is the person has time to reread it and reread it and reread it. And that's the big difference for me. So I can use language in a very different way with page poetry because I know that the person can go back to it. And if they don't get it the first time, they could always kind of read it over. Where with spoken word, it's like, okay, you get it or you don't get it, and then they give you a score. And that's, and that's kind of how it goes. But yeah, so I guess this is true with podcasts and with videos now. You kind of have the best of both worlds because people
Yeah.
can just listen to it once, or people can just play the video over and over again.
I mean, so your book of poetry is called To Mother, and your
Yeah.
podcast is called To Mother. Um, and I'll let you sort of speak more into it, but I will say that for someone who thinks, oh, well, mothering must mean this must only apply to people who have actually carried babies in their body and have gotten them out of their body and now they're raising them. And that's just not true. There's whatever mothering means, you have found a way to dig deep and wide in the description of motherhood.
Mm.
So tell us more about, especially reflecting back on your identity, as just realizing even from 11 years old that you were a poet and your deep roots in the Baha'i faith. And now you actually have become a mother in these past few years. But tell us about this role as a mother and how that relates.
Yeah, when I grew up, I had quite a challenge in terms of finding my identity because I was born in the Bahamas actually. So my great grandparents were pioneers and they lived in the Bahamas to teach about the Baha'i faith there, to build the community up there. And so I moved to the United States with my mom, and my grandparents came when I was six, I think. I was about 6 years old. So I didn't grow up in the American mindset of race. And this is a part
Hmm.
of this motherhood. It doesn't sound like it will be, but it is. So I didn't grow up with this American concept of race because in the Bahamas, everyone's pretty much brown. And when everyone's brown, and there's tourists and things like that, but it's much more based on personality. When everyone is the same skin color, it's much more defined that people have different personalities or class or job in society. And so when we moved to the United States, this was very perplexing for me. And my family, very educated. My great grandmother was a math and science professor. She had a master's degree at a time where it was really difficult for women to do things like that. So my family really pushed education on me. So I came to the United States and I'm well educated and I have this strong Bahamian accent and I've grown up in this more island laid back culture. And I really struggled at the beginning to fit in because I didn't fit the stereotype of what Black or white people felt was being Black American. And
Hmm.
so that was a challenge for me because it was so steeped in American culture what it meant to be Black or white that even Black people would assign certain things to uh, Black culture, and if you were doing something else, then you were trying to be white. And so, what I mean by that, for instance, music that you listen to, or the way that I talk, I really pronounced my my words very, very correctly because my grandmother was really big on that. Like, it's not get, it's get. She would say things like that all the time. And so people would say, "Oh, you're trying to be white," or white people would say, "Oh, you're like one of us." And I was like, "What does that
Hmm.
mean?" You know? And so that was really difficult for me to try and figure out who I was in terms of this racial divide. And I kind of came to an understanding or something that I felt comfortable with was being I'm just my mother's daughter. I felt like that was the
Hmm.
strongest definition I could give of who I was, and I was comfortable with that. So, what my values of who I want to be as a person and how I want to see the world are from my family. And so I really held on to this thing. And I didn't grow up with my father. So, yeah, I really held on to my identity being I'm my mother's daughter. And so that made it a lot easier for me to set goals for myself or to feel confident or to feel I could do whatever, And I had these conversations with my mom where I'd say, "Oh, people think I'm snobby," or "People told me I'm not this or I'm not that." And she was and still today, very encouraging and helpful. And yeah, so that is where it began with this strong relationship with my mom and my grandparents, feeling like my identity is a lot from my mother, from my lineage, from my family. And then I've just always loved children. Is like I said, these are three things that came naturally to me: poetry and the faith, the Baha'i faith, and children. I've just always loved children. Always wanted to work with children. Watch way more children's programming, and probably have read more children's books than anything else. And now I have a good excuse to, at least. And I guess my feeling was I always felt very heavy from the weight of the world. I always felt that I had a responsibility to alleviate suffering in the world for some reason. And I feel and I have felt very weighed down by that at times. And I realized that a lot of challenges that people have in the world are because of things that happened to them in their childhood. So I thought, if I can help children have loving and supportive experiences and find what their good qualities are and develop what their passions are, then that's kind of the greatest thing that I can contribute to life. And I'm doing a lot of work on myself while being a mother. And so, yeah, just this whole concept of motherhood. I mean, I'm sure a lot of it applies to fatherhood. It's just that I'm not a man and I didn't grow up with my father, so I didn't feel that I could comfortably reflect that perspective. But I'm sure a lot of it applies to parenthood in general. But I can just say, as a mother, yeah, there's so much teaching and learning at the same time, and it's so beautiful.
I love I mean, I haven't listened to every episode of your podcast yet, but I'm going to because I just love it. And I'm not a mother, but I appreciate how these three aspects of who you are, your identity as a mother and a poet and a Baha'i, really just shine through in every episode that I've listened to. I just think you do such a good job of communicating all three of those in such a well-rounded way. So we're definitely going to be linking to your podcast. But if I can just give a plug, as someone who's not a mother and who perhaps wouldn't seek out a podcast titled To Mother, I give 2 thumbs up to your podcast, and I recommend that all of our listeners give it a try because these are universal concepts. So we appreciate
That's
that
so
about
good
it.
to hear, actually, because usually I'm thinking in my mind, like, oh, this is for parents, and, it's nice to hear that. I also got some feedback about my book because I wrote the book To Mother, and I had some people, friends who were younger, who read it, and they were like, every woman should read this book, like, not just mothers, because it also, she said, made her reflect on her mother.
And it sounds like poetry has helped you throughout your life. You shared that, you kind of discovered poetry when your great grandfather died when you were 11. And that is kind of how that part of your identity was born, through something that obviously was difficult and you were grieving. And so poetry has been something that you turn to in difficult times, and also it's in listening to some of your poems, also in happy times, in celebratory times. And I'm sure that there are poems that you have written that you haven't shared with the world yet, or that you don't ever intend to share with the world. How do you decide which poems to put out there for the world to experience and which ones are just for you?
That's a great question. I am a very hard on my sleeve kind of person. I think that I don't really have an issue with sharing anything with people. um, for the most part, I don't have. That's been kind of complaints that I've heard in my life. I'm too nice, or and I thought, if that's what's on my gravestone, I'll be very happy. Like, here lies Andrea Hope. She was too nice, but I've heard this like several times.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of very hard on my sleeve, so there's not anything necessarily subject wise that I wouldn't share. I guess the only way I really decide is whether or not I feel that it's venting or that it's constructive. And I think that's just a quality of life kind of ideal that I have. Like I heard in the other episode, um, you all were talking about like focusing on negativity, and just trying to think about positive things. So in life, I think sometimes I have to write out things because I need to get it out of my system. But if I'm not finding a lesson in it, and if I'm not drawing back to empathy for the other person or for the experience, then I don't usually share those things, because then I'm just writing to vent my emotions, and that's important, but I don't know that it necessarily needs to be shared, because when you're writing from that space, you're only thinking of yourself, and you're only thinking of how you experience the situation. And so I've been trying to keep a balance of that. Like in this book, I really wanted to make sure that I talked about the tough parts of motherhood, and that it wasn't just because a lot, I don't know, sometimes we get so into this no negativity idea that we're unrealistic. And I didn't want mothers or anyone who, has a relationship with their mother to have this concept that, oh, the baby's just so cute and it's just loving all the time. And, like everyone wants this. And I didn't want to give this false impression of it as always being joyful and feeling like a miracle and a blessing, because it doesn't always feel that way for me. But I also wanted to make sure that when I talk about those other things, that I'm not just doing it to vent, but that there's some purpose in it, and I have to think about. And I think that's the power of poetry, is reflection. Um, Really, that it's basically like reflecting on your life in an elevator pitch. That's what I would say. Poetry is like, you have well, there's some long poems, but I don't read those ones. So you just have a few seconds or a few minutes to really focus on some aspect of your life, of your emotion, and that to me is what poetry does. And so yeah, I think, yeah, the only ones I could say I haven't shared are ones that I felt like, well, this isn't going to be helpful to anyone. Have you ever written an email where you're like, you wrote it and then you're like, yeah, okay, I'm not sending that? Yeah, it's like that feeling. Okay, that I wrote it, but yeah, I'm not going to do anything with it.
And I think like when I don't know the last time I wrote a poem. It might have been in school. In school everybody has to write a poem, even if it's an acrostic poem or and this is sort of true of all of these other people that we've talked to, all of these other artists. Like there's music class. My kids take dance and movement. There's things that as children we sort of are maybe feel more free to experiment, and school helps to encourage people to do that. But I think most adults I know wouldn't be thinking, yeah, I could benefit from writing a poem, or I could benefit from reading poetry. I have definitely felt intimidated, and some poems I'm like, oh yeah, I understand what that means. And someone will share a poem on Facebook and I'm like, I don't know what that's talking about. So Andrea, um, what would you say about poetry and its value to all humans? As far as ways that you might suggest, even little beginner baby steps for people to engage with creating poetry or savoring poetry, especially as we think about thin places and how we can sort of be transformed from just seeing ink on paper and actually feel transported to another state of being. What kinds of suggestions do you have about how we can encourage other people to experience that?
It's interesting that you make that analogy with dance, because I think eventually we start to learn that there's different kinds of dance. And you don't think, oh, because I don't like salsa, I don't like dance, or because I don't like ballet, I don't like dance, because we kind of come to understand that, oh, there's all these different types of dance, and you can also even make up your own dance. And I think perhaps we haven't gotten to that realization with poetry. And so I've heard another poetry professor at a university explain that when she hears people say that they don't like poetry, it's so strange to her. It's like someone saying they don't like music. And so she feels like you just haven't found the kind of poetry that speaks to you, because there's humor poetry. I'm sure there's niche poetry. I'm sure if you like Harry Potter, there's Harry Potter poems, and there's all these different kinds of poetry. So I think it's more maybe in school we might get confined by the certain idea of what poetry is, and then if we don't connect with that or we don't understand that, then we feel limited to do anything else with that. And so, yeah, there's spoken word, there's haiku, there are sonnets, there is all different, Instagram poetry now they call it, and there's just all different kinds. For me, I personally really prefer short poetry, or yeah, if it's a performance like 3 minutes or less, because maybe my mind, I can't focus, or there's so many deep concepts that I really want to think about them more deeply. And so I think, yeah, it would just be thinking about what you're interested in and trying to explore that through poetry, and then really seeing, okay, is there something that I can connect to, based on what my interests are, or based on the form of poetry that I'm most attracted to. And in terms of writing poetry, I think, maybe we learned a lot about rhyme, which I do think rhyme is wonderful. I naturally rhyme, so that's why I do it. I don't really force myself to rhyme that much. It just comes out naturally. But there aren't that many words in English that rhyme well, I feel like. You kind of end up using the same words over and over again, and you just have to play with how you use them. Um, so poetry doesn't have to rhyme. That's part of it. It can be free verse. It can be rhyming sometimes and not rhyming sometimes. Like it can, be however you want it to be. But for me, the power of poetry is to reflect on something deeply and and metaphorically. So for someone who's trying to write poetry, I would discourage writing poetry in a way that is not meaningful. So I would discourage, I think in school maybe we learn to write our name and then write a quality for each letter of our name or something. And so it can be very superficial and you're just trying to rhyme and write a poem about a pen or something like that. I would really think about the thing that you're scared to write about and try to write about
Hmm.
that. And write.
Gosh, you just went right there, didn't you?
Yeah, that's advice that I got recently at a poetry workshop. Like,
Oh.
write the poem that you've been avoiding, because
Mm. Andrea.
maybe you don't have time to write something about, a whole story, or maybe you write a diary entry or something. Like maybe you already keep a diary, and you're just trying to make that concise, or write it, like I said, in an elevator pitch. So I think if you write poetry about something that isn't superficial, then you can feel it, and you will resonate with it, and you can give yourself that kind of limit to just reflect on one thing for a period of time. One of the workshops that I hosted, I'll tell you, I don't know if it's going to sound hippie, but I collected stones. I think I had about 15 or so people in this workshop. All I did was collect stones. And I said, for the next 5 minutes, we're going to sit in silence and you're going to study this stone to the degree that if I put all these stones on the table, you would be able to pick out which one was yours. Now, I didn't actually make them do that, but that's how closely I wanted them to look at the stone. And then at the end of that 5 minutes, which felt like forever, then we had each person write an ode to the stone and write about how you are the same and how you are different. So, this is a really great, maybe, first step. If you can pick something in your life that's significant to you, whether it feels like it's just a day to day thing that you use or it's something that has history, like in your family, and just sit with it and just reflect with it and meditate on it and then write to it. And ask yourself, how are we connected and how are we not connected? So I remember my poem was talking about, um, you know, just like a stone, I talked about how some people tread on me accidentally, and some people do it on purpose. And I talked about all these, similarities that I have with the stone, and people had their personality reflected the poem. I love the poem so much, and so many people will always come and say, "Oh, I'm not a poet. I've just written a little bit, da da da," and it's always great. And I remember one guy, his whole poem was about how the stone reminded him of his mom's nose. And he was like, I don't know, she might be offended by that. And he wrote this poem about, Mom, this might offend you, but this stone reminds me. And it was very funny, but it also got very deep. And he told me afterward that his mom had just passed away the year before, and he hadn't processed it. So even though it was a very funny poem, he almost cried while writing the poem. So that was really something. So yeah, I think that would be my greatest recommendation is that, like you said, with these thin places, that you make it something that is reflecting on something deep, and then you'll be able to connect with it for that very purpose. And there are poems that don't. I think greeting cards are poems. That's the basic gateway into poetry. These greeting cards, but usually you buy a greeting card and then you write something yourself, and probably what you write yourself might be more poetic than what was in the card. But yeah, I think don't be afraid. Like you said, everything you write you don't have to share. Everything you write doesn't have to be good. um, if you do any kind of writing, you're going to know that anything that you write, the first draft doesn't need to be good. You just need to get out what your thoughts are and
Mm-hmm.
what you want to say, and then you can edit it down or you cannot.
Yeah. And a little plug, if somebody were wanting to edit and brush up and make their poetry in its rough draft into something that they might want to present in a more professional way, that's a service that you provide, right? That you help people with editing their own poetry.
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of poetry books, and it's been something so wonderful that I've done as a freelancer. And just when I kind of started getting into, I did a couple books, and then when I started focusing on just editing poetry, I was like, oh man, 11-year-old me would be so proud. But I just never would have thought in my mind, oh, maybe I could be a poetry editor. Yeah, so it's just like, man, it's really cool that I get to do it. And I love it. And I always learn something. Uh, and I always try to focus on the voice of the person. That's the thing that I've learned the most in poetry editing. Having people edit my work, sometimes it'll come back and it will be, well, that sounds great, but it doesn't sound like me. That's how I felt. So when I edit other people's poetry, if anyone's looking for their poetry to be edited, I really try to focus on what is this person's voice, where are they at in their journey, and trying to polish that to make it shine, but not to make it something that it isn't.
Well, you can be in a three-way fight with Rachel and I because we argue constantly about who has the better job because we
Oh
both
yeah,
think we
I
have
heard
the
about
best job in the world.
I heard about that. No, I think you I think I would submit to either of your jobs.
Mm.
I mean, I love poetry, but I think the entering this world and leaving this world, I
Mm.
mean, yeah, if any two people were able to compete about who has the most, at least impactful jobs, I think those would be it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Entering yeah, there's such power in this entering the world and leaving the world.
Hmm. Yeah. So one of your poems, you sort of um, gave the background information on about how it was one that you wrote when somebody important to you was leaving the world and when someone important to you was starting to enter the world. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that and even read that poem for us?
Yeah, I guess this is the poem that's probably the closest to this idea of thin places. And the background is that my great grandmother and I, as I mentioned before, were very close, are very close, I should say, because I believe she's still alive consciously. And she really wanted to see me have a baby. She knew it was something that was important to me and also important to her. And she never got to meet my husband because he's never been to the United States. And I was pregnant when she passed away, but I was only, I think, 3 weeks pregnant. So
Hmm.
we hadn't told anybody yet, and I hadn't even gone to an appointment. And so that's why first of all, I hadn't told her because how my grandmother was, if I told her, then everyone would know. So I knew that, okay, if I tell her, then everyone's going to call me and ask me.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, yeah, it was so early on, and especially when you're pregnant for the first time, it can be really nerve wracking. You have no idea, how your body is responding or if the baby's healthy. So I hadn't told anyone yet, and then a couple of weeks later, she passed away. And so that's why that's kind of the background behind me writing this poem called Psalm of Meadow and Sea. And Psalm is from the Bible because I felt like the poem was kind of more of a song. And so I used Psalm because I thought it was a bit more sing songy. Uh, yeah. So Psalm of Meadow and Sea. When we last held each other, both with shaking hands, Some things I would have said but never got the chance. But I feel somehow as my belly starts to grow, we're all swaying in this endless cosmic dance. Won't you meet me where the meadow greets the sea? Tell me stories of the tide until the sun sets me to sleep. And when I wake, I know the ropes and boats will all have been set free. Still, could we meet here where the meadow greets the sea?
I think, Andrea, I don't know if you've heard this before, Rachel. I'm guessing maybe you haven't. This is sort of a birth junkie factoid. But because your baby inside of your womb, if you have a baby girl, while she is in the womb, she grows and develops all of the eggs she will ever have in her entire life. So technically, we all, a part of us all grew within our own grandmother's bodies.
Yeah, I had heard that. So fascinating.
Yeah. So when you think about even just that cellular interconnectedness, the other thing is that when you carry a baby, your baby's DNA pieces of your baby's DNA break off in your own bloodstream. And so that's how they can now do blood tests to determine, they get fragments of your baby's own DNA and they can do genetic testing, and they can also determine the sex of your baby from your blood test. But some of those pieces of DNA also settle into your brain. So even long after you have parted the experience of sharing your body,
settle into your brain
with your own baby.
Wow.
Yeah, so both of your baby's DNA are still present in your own body as their mother.
Wow, that is
so
cool.
Who's to say what the actual metaphysical power is of that physical mystery and that physical connection? But, we can go back in generations and we go forward in generations, and we truly are connected through this mother experience, or this mother identity, to people long ago behind us and to the ones that come after us. And I find it so fascinating.
Super fascinating. So does that happen after they're born, or at what stage does it break off?
During pregnancy. Yeah. So during pregnancy, when you're, sharing a body, then parts of their DNA will settle into through your bloodstream, even into your brain.
Oh, that's fascinating. I was just thinking it's wonderful, because I was also thinking, because Rachel was saying, I was getting into all these different definitions of motherhood and things like that. And so I think I'll share that with some of my friends. I hope that could also be maybe something soothing to people who have lost children in the womb. Know that baby is still part of them. That's so beautiful. And yeah, that's in the book, I really tried to talk about these different forms of mothers. Like, I think we all know people who have suffered miscarriages or who have had issues with infertility, even if they haven't told us. Because just statistically, we all know people who have, whether or not they have said something to us or felt comfortable to talk about it. And so I definitely wanted to include something about that. At least, yeah, some I don't know, acknowledgement of people who are going through that. And also, yeah, different kinds of mothers, there's even that mother around the block, who was just everyone's mom, even though she wasn't your mom, kind of thing. And so I guess that principle of motherhood, to me, more than just, biologically being someone's mother, because there is a very special relationship in carrying a baby and having the same similar DNA and all of that stuff, but also just this role of being a nurturer and being someone who sacrifices and desires the best for another human being. But yeah, so I think I really tried to tap into those different kinds of mothers with the focus on being someone who is willing to nurture or to sacrifice for someone else's growth.
Andrea, we are just so blessed to have you on our podcast today. And again, I just really want to make sure that people know that you have a podcast out there and that it is fantastic. So can you tell us where people can find you if they want to look at your book or listen to your podcast or follow you on social media? What are all the ways that our listeners can find you?
Yeah, all the ways. I actually have a challenge with keeping up with all the ways. So I would recommend that people go to my website, andreahope.org, and they can find links to my books. My two books are To Mother, as we discussed, and I have another book that came out just recently called Will You Break the Silence, which is practical tips toward race unity. And so that's also a connection there because I published To Mother shortly after my first child was born, and I published Will You Break the Silence shortly after the death of George Floyd. And so they're my two books are connected to life and death in that way. But yeah, so those are the books that I have that you could find through my website. And yeah, I think that's the easiest, or email me so that I can talk to you if you're interested in having your poetry edited. Or I also write articles on a website called Write Spike. So that's where I have that writing prompt, like the Ode to the Stone. And I think I have that in that article. There's at least 4 other prompts that you could use for trying to write poetry, either in a group or by yourself. So my articles on Write Spike have a lot of tips about being a writer or being a poet. So I expect both of you to write a poem now.
Okay.
We have our homework assignments.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing that we usually ask all of our guests is there any charity or nonprofit organization that you really believe in the cause of what they're doing, that if we could ask our listeners to be generous on your behalf with your same sense of passion, where might you direct people to be generous toward on your behalf?
I was thinking about this because I know you're going to ask this question. And I'm generally a person who likes to contribute locally. Like, I believe in the global principles, but I really believe in like locally supporting. So if you want to go above and beyond, I would say whatever field that you're in terms of your hobby or your professional life, that you find an organization that contributes to low income or at-risk youth who are interested in that, and you contribute, because I think when it's close to home, it means so much more. So if you're an accountant or you're a video producer or something like that, and you can find an organization that provides opportunities that you would have loved to have or that you did have growing up, to someone who is less likely to have that just because of where they were born or how they were born, I think that would be really wonderful. But if you want something specific to poetry, for me, there's an organization called Exhale Collective, and it's a woman's, anyone who defines themselves as a woman of color. They highlight the voices, and I went to an online virtual poetry event with them, and it was so therapeutic. And so I think it's in California, so it just happened to be because of the pandemic that I was able to join them, because usually I wouldn't have been able to. But the space was just so loving and nurturing. And so I think in terms of poetry, Exhale Collective, I would love for people to donate to them and let them know I sent you. Yes. So they know they're appreciated. Yes.
So the very, very last thing, which I don't know how feasible it is because you are so kind to call in from Poland, and we can tell that it's getting very dark there. But I would love if you would take us out by reading your poem To Mother as the last thing our listeners get to hear from us today.
To Mother. Motherland, mother lode, mother temple, mother tongue. Mother wake, mother work, mother worry, mother run. To your side, to your rescue, to your dreams, mother comes. By marriage, by fostering, by adoption, by birth. Mother of one, mother of all, godmother, Mother Earth. Mother to loss, mother's lost. Mother's found, mother become. To uplift, to take pride, to sacrifice for another. to mother.
Thank you so much. You are a gift to the world, and your time with us was a gift to us and a gift to all our listeners. So thank you so much. And thank you to your sweet babies for sharing their mama for this time together.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Now it's our turn to hear from you. So would you do us a big favor and go into your podcast app and rate us? Even better, would you write us a glowing review? That will help other listeners to find us. And make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode.
You can also visit our website at everydaythinplaces.com, where you will find all sorts of fun and interesting information, as well as learn about how you can help to support this podcast and earn special exclusive perks. There you will also find links to follow us on social media, or else just pop directly over to Instagram or Facebook, where you will find us at Everyday Thin Places. Thanks so much for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Rachel. Bye.